By the time she was out shopping, the man who owned that car was already dead, and she was still driving it. Through Seattle, in daylight, past stores, past traffic, past people who had no idea they were looking at a dead man's Toyota Prius. That is how this case begins. Not with sirens, not with a chase, not with some dramatic manhunt. With errands. A hair appointment, a shopping stop, family visits. Nothing about it looks urgent. Nothing about it looks like the aftermath of a killing. But that Prius belonged to Amare Geda, a rideshare driver, a husband, a father, a man who had just finished another late-night shift and never made it home. And that is what makes this case so cold. Because while his family had already stepped into the worst night of their lives, the teenage girl accused of killing him kept moving through the next 2 days like the world had not changed. Remember the errands, because later, those errands stop looking casual. They start looking like evidence. And once police finally got her in a room, the story started moving too. First, she said she bought the car. Then she said she needed help. Then she tried to explain the shooting. But the problem for her was simple. The evidence wasn't moving with her. The timeline wasn't changing. The camera wasn't changing. And by the time this case reached a courtroom, her version was already in trouble. So before we go any further, subscribe now if you want the cases where the lies don't survive the evidence, because this one only gets worse. A dead driver in the street. A stolen car moving through Seattle in broad daylight. 3 changing stories. 1 surveillance video. And when the courtroom finally had all of it in one place, this stopped sounding like panic and started sounding like a story her own words could not save. August 8, 2023. Around 3:20 in the morning, maybe a few minutes later, in Seattle's Sodo neighborhood, police got a call about an unresponsive man in the road. The location was near First Avenue South and South Walker Street. Industrial, dark, mostly empty at that hour. When officers got there, they found a man down in the street. That man was Amare Geda, 52 years old, working another late-night shift. A rideshare driver, trying to make it through one more night of work and get back home to his family. And this is where the case turns cold, fast. Because while police were responding to a man lying dead in the roadway, the vehicle that should have been with him was already gone. His Toyota Prius had been taken, and later, that same car would be seen moving through the city in broad daylight. Salon stops, store runs, family visits. That contrast is what makes this case so hard to shake. One life had already ended, but the person accused of taking it kept moving through the next 2 days like the world had not changed. No frantic disappearance, no total collapse, no sign, at least from the timeline, that ordinary movement had stopped. And the deeper investigators looked, the worse that contrast got. Because this was not just a missing car, it was a dead man's car. A husband's car, a father's car, a working man's car. And somewhere between that dark stretch of road in Sodo and those daylight errands that came after, something happened in a matter of seconds that would destroy one family and drag an 18-year-old into a murder case that would later end in court. So now the real questions start. Who was Amare Geda, really? And how did a man finishing another ordinary shift end up dead in the street after an encounter that investigators say lasted only 7 seconds? Amare Geda was the kind of man a family builds its life around. Not because he was famous, not because he was loud, not because he demanded attention, but because he showed up, day after day, night after night, year after year. He was an Ethiopian immigrant, a husband, a father, a working man who carried responsibility, the way a lot of people do, in silence, without ever expecting applause for it. For about 14 years, he worked 2 jobs. By day, he worked at SeaTac Airport. By night, he drove rideshare. That was his routine. That was the grind. That was how he kept life moving for the people depending on him. And people around him knew exactly what kind of man he was. Not reckless, not unstable, not drifting through life. Steady, reliable, the kind of person his community looked at and trusted. He was also connected to the rideshare driver community in Seattle, a union-linked worker, a mentor, someone other drivers respected. The kind of man who had earned that respect the slow way, by being there, by helping, by working, by doing what needed to be done. And that is where the injustice in this case starts cutting deeper. Because when you strip away the legal terms, the surveillance footage, the police interviews, the courtroom arguments, this is what you are left with. A man who spent years building stability for other people is gone after an encounter that lasted seconds. That's the imbalance. That's what makes this case feel so brutal. He wasn't out there looking for trouble. He was finishing another shift, trying to get through another night of work, trying to get home. And on the other side of this story, police say an 18-year-old girl would soon be driving his car through Seattle like the day still belonged to her. He was finishing another work shift. She was about to start a stolen, ordinary day. And before investigators ever heard the changing stories, before the courtroom, before the sentencing, there was just this hard, ugly truth. A father who kept showing up for his family did not make it home. And the next question is the one that sits at the center of the whole case. How did his final shift end in just 7 seconds? He had already completed a rideshare trip. The night was nearly over. Amare Geda was sitting in his Toyota Prius in Seattle's SoDo neighborhood, stationary, alone, just after 3:20 in the morning. And then someone approached the car. That someone, investigators said, was Niana Allen Bailey. A nearby surveillance camera captured what happened next. Not for minutes, not for some long, drawn-out confrontation. For about 7 seconds. She comes up to the vehicle. A struggle happens outside. Fast, tight, sudden. Then Geda falls into the roadway. And just like that, the whole case changes shape. Because after Geda falls, Allen Bailey gets into the Prius and drives away. That's it. 7 seconds. A work shift ends. A father is left in the street. A car disappears into the dark. And that brevity matters, because when something happens that fast, every later explanation gets squeezed by the timeline. Every word has less room to hide. Every excuse has to survive those 7 seconds. And later, when police finally got her into a room, she would start telling them what she claimed happened. If it happened that fast, how did she later try to explain it away? When police finally caught up with Niana Allen Bailey, the car was no longer the only thing that mattered. Now, it was the story. How did she get it? Why was she driving it? What had happened on that dark stretch of road in SoDo? And almost immediately, her answers started shifting. At first, she told investigators she had bought the car online. That was version 1. Simple, clean. And if it were true, it would explain why she had the Prius without explaining anything else. But that version didn't hold, so the story moved. Now she said she had been assaulted, that she needed help, that this wasn't some random theft story, it was her trying to survive a dangerous situation. That was version 2. Different tone, different position, different purpose. The first version tried to explain the car. The second version tried to explain her. But even that didn't last, because the story changed again. Now Allen Bailey said Amare Geda got out of the Prius, that he grabbed her shoulders, that she had a gun, that she dropped it, picked it back up, and fired. That was version 3. And by this point, the pattern was hard to miss. The facts were not shifting. Her version was. That is what makes this part of the case so important. Not just that she gave an explanation, but that the explanation kept moving every time the pressure changed. First, a story about ownership. Then, a story about danger. Then, a story about the shooting itself. And every new version felt like it was trying to solve the problem the last one couldn't. That is where viewers lock in. Because once a story starts changing like that, The audience begins watching for one thing, not what happened, but where the version breaks. And by the time she reached the third version, the case already had something stronger than memory. It had the timeline, it had the car, and it had surveillance footage that wasn't changing for anybody. By now, this case was no longer resting on what Niana Allen Bailey said happened. Because before police ever sat her down, before the stories started shifting, before the courtroom ever had to weigh her words, the encounter had already been captured on surveillance. That matters. Because once video enters a case like this, the argument changes. Now it is not just memory against memory, not just fear against explanation, not just one person's version against another person's silence. Now there is a camera. And cameras do not panic. They do not forget. They do not reframe themselves after the fact. The footage became the silent witness, cold, unemotional, unimpressed by whatever came later. And what that footage showed was brutally short. The confrontation lasted about 7 seconds. That number matters more than people think, because 7 seconds leaves very little room for confusion, very little room for a long, evolving narrative, very little room for a story to keep expanding every time new pressure is applied. That is why the timeline starts squeezing her version, because every later explanation has to fit inside those 7 seconds. And if it doesn't, the problem is no longer what she remembers. The problem is that the evidence is not bending with her. That is where this case starts turning away from explanation and toward contradiction. Stories can shift. Video doesn't. And once investigators had both in front of them, the next 48 hours, the errands, the movement, the stolen car, the stops around Seattle, stopped looking like random aftermath. They started looking like part of the case. And this is where the case starts feeling even colder. Because the story opened with ordinary errands. Now those errands start looking like evidence. For about the next 2 days, Allen Bailey kept using Amare Geda's Toyota Prius. Not briefly, not just long enough to abandon it. She kept moving through the Seattle area with it. A hair salon in Kent, a Walmart stop where more than $750 was spent. Family visits, more driving, more movement, more time passing with a dead man's car still in use. And it wasn't just the car. Investigators said Geda's personal belongings were discarded, and through all of this, the firearm remained in the vehicle. That sequence matters, not because it tells us everything about what she was thinking, it doesn't, but because, in court, prosecutors argued it undercut any simple story of blind panic. Panic is chaos. This timeline showed something else. Movement, stops, choices, ongoing decision-making after the shooting. That's what made these errands so important. A salon visit is not just a salon visit anymore. A Walmart checkout is not just a Walmart checkout anymore. A family stop is not just a family stop anymore. Now, every stop becomes part of the larger question. What does the next 48 hours look like after a 7-second confrontation leaves a man dead in the street? And the answer, according to the evidence, was this. The car kept moving. The city kept moving. She kept moving. But the case was moving too, because somewhere between those daylight errands, the discarded belongings, the purchases, and the gun still inside that car, investigators were getting closer. And then, the whole thing cracked open because of something so ordinary, it almost sounds too small to matter. A parking complaint. And this is the twist that blew the whole thing open. Not some dramatic raid, not a high-speed chase, not a breakthrough confession. A parking complaint. August 10th, 2023. 2 days after Amare Geda was found dead in the street, Seattle officers responded to a complaint near a closed street fair in the Capitol Hill/Denny Park area. Just a car where it shouldn't have been. Ordinary, annoying, the kind of call nobody expects to lead into a murder case. But when officers checked the vehicle, they realized it was Geda's stolen Toyota Prius. And just like that, the whole atmosphere changed. This was no longer parking enforcement. This was homicide surveillance. Plainclothes detectives kept watch, quietly, deliberately. No rush, no noise, no warning. They didn't confront the car immediately. They waited. And then Alan Bailey came back. That's the part that sticks. After everything that had already happened, after the body in the road, after the driving, the shopping, the stops, the discarded belongings, she came back to the car. And when she did, detectives moved in. The arrest was quiet, controlled. No chase, no dramatic standoff, just a case tightening shut around her in real time. That's why this moment matters so much, because the break in the case came from something almost boring. And somehow, that makes it even colder. A homicide case opened wider because someone parked a dead man's car where it didn't belong. But getting arrested was only the start of her real problem, because once detectives had her, they also had questions. And when those questions started coming, her story didn't hold still. But here's the part that makes this case feel less random and more like escalation. The gun did not appear out of nowhere. It had already surfaced. 13 days earlier, before Amare Geda was killed in Soto, before the stolen Prius, before the parking complaint, before the changing stories, there had already been another incident. July 26, 2023. The setting was the Mount Baker bicycle tunnel in Seattle. Investigators said Alan Bailey and others were allegedly inside that tunnel spray painting graffiti when a WSDOT worker monitoring the area through live video confronted what was happening. That worker was not just yelled at. According to the case summary, the worker was physically assaulted, hospitalized, and had property stolen. And during that confrontation, Alan Bailey allegedly displayed a firearm. That detail matters a lot, because later, investigators said Alan Bailey identified that firearm, the one connected to the tunnel incident, as the same weapon used in the shooting of Amare Geda. That does not turn this into a second story. It turns it into a warning sign, a glimpse of something already in motion. Because once that connection is in the record, the killing in Soto stops feeling like a weapon appearing from nowhere in one isolated moment. Now the audience sees something else. A gun already present, already introduced into conflict, already close to violence. And then, 13 days later, that same weapon fires. That is the escalation. That is the chill in it. The gun did not appear out of nowhere. It had already surfaced. 13 days later, it fired. And once detectives had that timeline in front of them, the case wasn't just about what happened in 7 seconds anymore. It was also about what may have been building before those 7 seconds ever started. This is where the case stops sounding like a shifting story and starts sounding like a story collapsing under its own weight. Because by the time detectives sat down with Niana Allen Bailey, they had already recovered the car. They already had the timeline. They already had the surveillance. And now they had her words. At first, she said she bought the Prius online. That was version 1. Then the story changed. Now she said she had been assaulted, that she needed help, that what happened next came out of that fear. That was version 2. Then the story changed again. This time, Alan Bailey said Amare Geda got out of the car, that he grabbed her shoulders, that she had a gun, dropped it, picked it up, and fired. That was version 3. And if this section were only about contradiction, that would already be bad enough. But it got worse. Because buried inside her own account was the detail that started stripping away the defense she seemed to be building. Alan Bailey acknowledged that Geda did not speak to her. He did not strike her. He did not kick her. And she admitted she likely could have left without shooting him. That is the moment the whole thing tightens. Because now, this is not just about changing stories. This is internal collapse. The self-defense frame does not just come under pressure from police. It starts breaking from inside her own statement. She didn't just change her story. At one point, she weakened it herself. And once that admission is on the table, every earlier version starts looking different. The first version tried to explain the car. The second tried to explain her fear. The third tried to explain the shooting. But that concession, that he did not speak, did not hit, did not kick, and that she could have left, cut straight through all of it. By then, the question is no longer just, what is she saying happened? Now the question is, how much of her own version can survive her own words? And here's where we want to hear from you. Do you think those changing stories were panic, or do you think the truth was collapsing in real time once the evidence started closing in? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because what happened next in court made that question even harder to ignore. By the time this case reached a courtroom, the central question had already changed. At the beginning, the tension was simple. Who killed Amare Geda? What happened in those 7 seconds? Why was his car still moving through Seattle 2 days later? But once the surveillance, the timeline, the recovered Prius, the changing stories, and her own admissions were all in the record, the case stopped revolving around whether investigators could build it. Now it was about what the court would do with it. Alan Bailey was initially charged with first-degree murder. At her early court proceedings, bail was set at $2 million, and she stayed in custody. That matters because it shows how seriously the case was being treated from the start. But the biggest shift came later. On February 26, 2026, Alan Bailey entered a guilty plea to an amended charge of second-degree murder with a firearm enhancement. And in that same proceeding, she also pleaded guilty in the separate tunnel-related case tied to the earlier assault. That plea changed the entire courtroom atmosphere, because now the room was no longer preparing for a full battle over guilt. That fight was over. The question had become heavier than that. What does a court do with an 18-year-old who committed a killing, then spent the next 2 days moving through ordinary life in a dead man's car? What does it do with youth, with trauma, with instability, with contradiction, with a family that will never get its normal life back? That is what sentencing cases like this become. Not a clean debate, a weighing. One side of the room holding up mitigation, the other holding up damage. One side talking about age, history, and circumstances. The other talking about a husband, a father, a provider, and a family left behind. And once the plea was entered, the courtroom no longer had to ask, did she do it? Now it had to answer something harder. How do you sentence irreversible loss? And this is where the courtroom stopped being about her story and started becoming about his life. Because once Nayana Allen Bailey entered that guilty plea, the next question was no longer guilt. It was weight. How much weight does the court give to age, to trauma, to instability, to substance use? And how much weight does it give to what was taken from Amare Geda's family in 7 seconds on a dark street in Soto? At sentencing, prosecutors asked for more than 23 years. The defense asked for the low end. That is the courtroom split in cases like this. One side looks backward at youth, history, mitigation, and all the things that shaped the defendant before the crime. The other side looks outward at the body in the road, the stolen Prius, the family left without a father, and the damage that keeps going long after the police tape comes down. The defense presented mitigation, youth, trauma history, instability, substance use context. Alan Bailey addressed the court too. And that matters because sentencing is often the moment when the legal case narrows, but the human reality expands. Up to this point, much of this story has revolved around her actions, her movement, her changing versions, her explanations. But in that courtroom, the center of gravity started shifting. Because now the room had to face what those explanations were being weighed against. A husband who did not come home. A father whose shift became his last shift. A family forced to keep living in the space his absence left behind. That is what makes sentencing hearings like this so brutal. The law talks in years, families live in after. The legal arguments stayed in the room. The damage didn't. And then, the courtroom heard something that made that damage impossible to keep at a distance. A child's voice. And then the courtroom heard something no legal argument could soften. A song. Not from a lawyer, not from a prosecutor, not from a judge. From Amare Geda's son. A recording was played in court, and in that recording, his son sang about wishing he could have stopped his father from going to work that night. That is the moment this case stops feeling like a case file. Because up to then, the courtroom had already heard the structure of it. The charge, the plea, the mitigation, the timeline, the sentencing range, the arguments. The case had already been explained. Then the song made everyone hear it. That is what made this moment so devastating. This was not just another victim impact statement. It was grief without legal language, loss without courtroom polish. A child's voice carrying the part of the crime no statute can fully measure. And once that happened, the distance was gone. Now Amare Geda was no longer just the name attached to the charge. Now he was a father whose child was singing about one ordinary work shift that turned into the night he never came home. Now the sentence was no longer just a number waiting to be announced. Now it was being measured against a child wishing he could go backward in time and stop his father from leaving for work. That is why this moment lands so hard. Because everything hardens here. The victim becomes more than a name. The sentence becomes more than a number, and the cost becomes impossible to keep abstract. The courtroom had already heard about the killing. Now it was hearing what the killing left behind. And after that song, the room no longer belonged to legal argument. It belonged to the family. And after that, the courtroom stopped belonging to her. Because once the family's words filled that room, her explanations started shrinking. Not disappearing, but shrinking. Whatever she said about herself, whatever mitigation was raised, whatever history, trauma, or instability the defense placed before the court, none of it could stand at the center anymore. Now the center was the family, Amare Geda's wife, his children, the people who were not living in legal language, but in permanent absence. And that is where this hearing became almost unbearable. Because the children were not talking about sentencing ranges. They were trying to make sense of a father who was simply gone. One of the most devastating details to come out of the hearing was this. Geda's daughter said that when she grows up, she wants to become an Uber driver so that someone might harm her too, and she could see her father again. That is the kind of sentence that breaks a courtroom. Because it shows how children try to reason through grief when grief makes no sense. It shows what this crime actually did, not just to a victim, not just to a case file, not just to a courtroom calendar, to a family's reality, to the way children now understand work, danger, loss, and whether a parent is ever really coming home again. This is where the documentary fully pivots away from her explanations. For months, the case had revolved around what she did. In that courtroom, it finally revolved around who he was. A husband, a father, a provider, a man whose absence had become the loudest thing in the room. And once that happened, the sentence was no longer the only thing people were waiting for. Now they were waiting to see whether any number the court could pronounce would feel remotely equal to what had been taken. And then the sentence came. Not with relief, not with triumph, not with anything that could honestly be called balance. Just a number. And even then, not a number that could fix what had been broken. For the second-degree murder conviction, the court imposed 180 months. For the firearm enhancement, another 60 months. Total, 240 months, 20 years. After that would come community custody. There were also treatment conditions attached, and the court ordered restitution. That is how the law speaks in cases like this. Months, enhancements, conditions, obligations. numbers arranged into consequence. But the reason this moment lands so heavily is because everyone in that courtroom already knew what the sentence could not do. It could not return Amare Geda to his wife. It could not return a father to his children. It could not erase the image of a child singing about wishing he could have stopped his dad from going to work that night. 20 years is a sentence. It is not an equal exchange. The sentence closed a case file. It did not close the hole left in that family. And in the end, there were still things the public record never fully answered. Exactly where the gun came from. Everything that happened in the space before it fired. Details the guilty plea made unnecessary to fully fight out in open court. But the final truth of this case does not depend on any of those missing pieces, because the part that matters most was never really in doubt. She kept moving. Hair appointment, store aisles, family visits, a dead man's car. That is the image this case leaves behind. Not just the street in Soto, not just the courtroom, not just the sentence. That image. A man is gone, and the world for the person accused of taking him appears to keep going. But for Amare Geda's family, ordinary life did not keep going. A shift at work became the last goodbye. A father became an absence. A child's song became evidence of grief. A sentence was announced. And none of it, not the years, not the courtroom, not the verdict, not the restitution, could buy back normal life. That is the hardest truth in this story. Not just that a man died, but that one family had to keep living after the kind of loss no sentence can truly measure. She got 2 more days of ordinary life. His family lost theirs for good. If this case stayed with you, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who follows true crime, and subscribe for more courtroom documentaries told with the full weight they deserve. And if you want to honor Amare Geda in a simple way, leave one word for him in the comments, because long after the sentence is read, the loss is what remains.